Welcome to Inside Safety, a podcast series by Herbert Smith Freehills that explores the latest developments in workplace health and safety law and practice.
Hello and welcome to Inside Safety, a podcast from the Herbert Smith Freehills Employment, Industrial Relations and Safety team. This is a new podcast for us this year and this is the first episode, so thank you for joining us. We've had an Inside IR podcast, a podcast that's been produced for industrial relations, HR and legal professionals, which has been really successful. You know, it's you often go to a client meeting with one of our pure IR specialist lawyers and the client in the room has been listening to their podcast that morning on the way to work, which I think is very flattering. So we've diversified. We've got a new podcast series now for employment and this one for occupational health and safety. So thank you for joining us. My name is Steve Bell. I'm the managing partner of the Employment, Industrial Relations and Safety team here at Herbert Smith Freehills. I'm based in our Melbourne office and I'm here with
Nerida Jessup. I'm a partner in the Sydney Employment, Industrial Relations and Safety practice.
Thanks, Nerida. Thanks for helping me kick off this podcast series. What's our topic today? What are we talking about?
So we're talking about psychosocial health and safety, which is, I think it's probably wrong to describe this as an emerging topic, but it's certainly been dominating our practice for the last 2 or so years, and I think it'll be with us for a very long time. So it's a great topic to start.
Yeah. I mean, the genesis of why this is a new area of health and safety regulation is probably worth kind of reflecting on.
Yeah.
Over the last decade or so, we've had any number of productivity commission reports, other parliamentary inquiries, other levels of academic analysis that say that mental health and mental injury at work is deteriorating, that the position is sort of getting worse. And about 3 or 4 years ago, there was a suggestion that we could do more in terms of the way in which we regulate this under work health and safety law. And it's having an economic impact. I mean, the productivity review talks about the billions of dollars of lost productivity associated with people being not at their best at work, not able to thrive or even absent from work. In my home state of Victoria, the Victorian government has reformed the workers' comp regime because effectively that regime was being driven underwater as a result of the volume of what we'll call stress claims, the pejorative language of a sort of a slower onset mental injury claim. So there's a burning platform here. There's kind of a social burning platform, there's an economic burning platform, there's a workers' comp burning platform here for change, for this to be an area of focus for business. But is it fair to say that the existing laws, even without the reforms we're going to chat about today, the existing laws always kind of had this as an obligation, hasn't it?
Yeah, I think that's right. There's not been technically a change to the law. So for a decade plus, there's been a very high standard of care that applies under WHS regulatory regimes to manage physical as well as psychological health and safety. But I think that the change over the last 5 years really reflects probably what you've spoken about there, which is there is more work for WHS law and regulation to do in the area of psychological health.
Yeah.
So traditionally we have actually seen WHS laws respond to psychosocial health and safety issues, although we probably didn't use that language. So there's always been examples of very egregious bullying and workplace conduct type issues, which have been prosecuted on occasion. Occupational violence and workplace violence, we've seen a focus from safety regulators in the past and for many years, which is a physical health and safety risk, but also a psychosocial health and safety risk.
Yeah.
And then issues that we've always understood, like exposure to traumatic materials, so first responders. They're all psychosocial health and safety issues. I think what we have seen is a real expansion of those psychosocial or psychological impacts which will come within the focus of safety regulators. So that is law and policy makers really broadening the focus of safety regulation.
Yeah. And what is interesting, I think, is we go from the things that are obvious material events which have the potential for, harm, for genuine harm for the people who are experiencing them. That has been and continues to be, an area of regulatory focus. But what's changed specifically? How have we kind of expanded that into the things that probably require more nuanced thought, the way in which we design work, the way in which we allocate tasks, the way in which we support our people to thrive in the work that they're doing? That is kind of more subtle. So how have we tried to kind of reform the law to force that focus on those more subtle areas?
The reform has come through probably primarily the introduction in most jurisdictions of prescriptive psychosocial regulations, which really impose a methodology which employers must adopt in assessing risk, managing risk to psychosocial health and safety. It is very prescriptive.
Yep.
And what those regulations require is that businesses consider psychosocial hazards. There is a range of code of practices which have been published across the jurisdictions and some real through lines in the common psychosocial hazards which are described. So now we're talking about low job control, high job demands, organisational justice, poor management support, issues which traditionally we would have looked at as purely employment issues are now being looked at with a safety lens.
Yeah.
And there has been, in articulating how employers must apply WHS thinking to these kind of broader psychosocial hazards, what it really requires is employers to manage psychosocial health and safety as they manage physical risk. So applying risk management processes, assessing the risks and hazards in their business, selecting controls and applying a risk management process. And in some jurisdictions, the guidance requires employers to, for example, apply the hierarchy of controls, which is it's an interesting tool. It was a tool that it was developed in the mid-20th century to apply to physical risks, really, starting at the top, engineering controls and moving down.
Can we put a guard on this dangerous machine?
Exactly. And so these kind of traditional physical safety concepts are now being applied in the space of psychosocial health and safety.
Yeah, which is interesting. And I think that's my observation of the way in which businesses that we're dealing with are thinking this through, that it's a discipline, a risk manager discipline, which is really familiar to the health and safety professional, but a subject matter which is often the expertise doesn't necessarily or hasn't traditionally sat in the health and safety team. This is what's so interesting, I think, about the moment is organisations are kind of have to mobilise different parts of their business. I'm thinking now sort of medium to large organisations. They'll need to mobilise their thinking about the architecture of this. How do we go through that risk management process? But the content of it will probably sit elsewhere in the business. The workers' comp team will have an insight on this. The HR or the people and culture team will have an insight. The legal and the ops teams will have insights in relation to this. And I think organisations that I'm seeing manage this new law, I say new, it's probably a couple of years old in some jurisdictions now, these new laws well is by bringing that kind of multidisciplinary thinking to bear. But can I ask you this? We would collectively brief businesses, day in, day out, and sometimes there's a sense of despair. Does this mean that do we have to get rid of stress at work? Like, does everyone have to be happy at work? Is that what these new laws are getting at? Can I give someone performance management discussions? Can I ask them to stretch into new areas or do things that might be uncomfortable within their competence? Is that where we're going? Is that what the new law, it's a Dorothy Dixon question, is that where the new law is going, do you think?
No, that's not what the law requires. Really, what WHS duties require is that employers go through a process, and that process is forward-thinking and it is applying a risk management process. But there is also a recognition in this space that part of this is job fit. If you look at common psychosocial hazards, we have this discussion with employers, well, how can high job demands be a psychosocial hazard, but so can low job demand? How is this possible? And some of this is individuals will respond in different ways to different stresses. So you can still have high performance work, you can still work long hours, but what these laws require you to do is look at the demands of your workplace and look at the cohorts of workers that you have and really divide that up appropriately, so that if you are looking at a high workload, high work demands, the controls that you would put in place for those workers are very, very different than if you are looking at high turnover workforce working, in a food restaurant, and so it just requires that you apply a risk management process. The obligation is not to de-risk work, you never will, but it is to do what you reasonably can to reduce the adverse impacts of work on psychological health. Yeah,
I think that's beautifully put. And I think the point here is to help businesses and professionals remember this is about harm minimization, not about minimizing things that might be adverse or challenging or difficult. That's what our economy is based on. That sort of sense of entrepreneurialism and stretch. I think businesses that try to have jobs where everyone is comfortable and no one is stretched and no one is potentially stressed, businesses like that will not succeed. So we need to manage those two things. And
I think
harm is the backstop.
Yeah, I think that's right. And a lot of, work is challenging, and that's part of what people get out of work as well. In looking at this, there's a lot of positive psychological impact from work as well, and recognising that some of the things that can be hazards are also what attracts people to work, or what will put people in a place where they're thriving as well. So
that's interesting.
Yeah.
One of the things we should tell the listeners and the viewers about is variations across the various jurisdictions. We're in a harmonised work health and safety environment, which everyone says with a snigger because we're not. Every jurisdiction has almost inevitably departed from the model health and safety laws in some way. In my jurisdiction, where I'm based, where I live, based in Victoria, we've actually not introduced the black letter positive obligation into the occupational health and safety regulations yet. It's weird. Victoria was probably one of the first jurisdictions to propose these model changes, and a lot of work was done by businesses reflecting on those and making comment on the consultation period, etc. And then years has passed. I think an Olympics has passed since we've actually had reform. But this last month, the government has announced they will introduce those laws. They will come into effect. So they say by the end of 2025, we're talking about October 2025 or so, and I reckon there'll be a staged implementation process. So I only flag that because if you're part of a multi-state business and you've been holding back because the Victorian jurisdiction has not yet introduced the new laws, I think there's probably no basis to hold back anymore. You should take a national approach. There's general consistency subject to a few variations. What are the other variations? Queensland's done something unusual?
Queensland has done something unusual. So Queensland has introduced into its WHS regs a requirement for a documented sexual harassment prevention plan, which is basically a documented risk management tool outlining controls to prevent sexual harassment in the workplace. So that's a bit of a quirk. There are other quirks across the jurisdictions. One of the quirks relates to whether psychological illnesses are notifiable. So the position in WA is different from New South Wales, depending on whether there's a time off work notification requirement, for example. And there are many, many codes of practices published across the jurisdiction, which all have their nuances of quirks as well. So
right. And I think Safe Work Australia is proposing, so yet to be introduced into law, but it's a pretty good indication of what's coming, proposing a change to incident notification duties under work health and safety law. These are criminal-backed obligations. A breach of a notification duty is an offence, can be prosecuted in the criminal courts, and they're going to change the expectations to broaden the sorts of non-physical injuries that might arise, or even loss of life injuries that might arise, where an employer would be required to notify the regulator. In Victoria, the last draft we saw of the proposed regulations had a positive reporting obligation. So twice a year, organisations needed to report. So the draft says, and presumably this will become the law, positive duty to report psychosocial complaints in relation to a few areas, bullying, occupational violence and a few other matters, sexual harassment. Report the number of complaints that a business has received, and then a few other things. Report the gender of those who were complainants or complained about, and some other information. And that is going to have to be, by law, for businesses over 500 people, reported to the safety regulator. And you can see the safety regulator here is sort of picking up the slack almost of the respect at work reforms that were undertaken over the last 4 or 5 years or so, identifying the gendered impact of these sorts of issues at work. So it's just interesting that each jurisdiction is kind of layering up, I suppose, and where one state imposes a reporting obligation, you would kind of bet your bottom dollar that other states would. So we'll wrap this up for the listeners, but what's your sort of take-home message? When you're talking to clients about this, how are you kind of helping them face into these changes? How is it looking and feeling different on the ground?
Yeah, I think there's probably two ways that this really comes up with businesses. A lot of the work that I'm doing, and certainly the matters that are keeping me very busy, is where businesses are facing into this probably for the first time in the context of either interest from unions, often in pretty heated industrial environments, or a safety investigation. We're dealing with a number of safety investigations in the context of kind of intractable workplace disputes where a whistleblower complaint has been made, where we might have federal court proceedings on foot. And at the same time, we will have a very complex, very onerous safe work investigation looking into traditional, fundamentally employment issues and how they were handled, almost black hatting management's decision making. So that is...
Many of those complaints or concerns or claims now are using this language, aren't they, of psychosocial risk. So it's, again, that kind of intersection of HR and external regulatory attention. Yeah. It's a really kind of different environment for
incredible.
Many businesses, yeah.
I think that's the probably more difficult way to face into this.
Yes.
The employers that I think have found the step change easiest have the written systems in place. Unfortunately, I think there really is an expectation now that we've got all these tools of compliance, the codes of practice, the regulations, there is an expectation that employers will be able to show they're working on a lot of these issues.
And you're pretty exposed if you can't, I think.
I think that's right.
Then you're sort of falling back on good intent and values and sort of generic concepts, but you need to be able to prove you put some work in here.
I think that's exactly right. So if you've worked through the processes, you actually have taken these issues into account. I think you can very confidently face into examples where there has been mental health issues or complaints or issues that have bubbled up in the workforce if you've got that system in place and you can demonstrate that system complies with that risk management framework. So I think a lot of this work, the good work that we are doing, is helping employers really look at what they intuitively understand a lot. You know, who are your workers? What are your workforce?
What are they going to do?
Exactly. And how a lot of the work that will be done to control these risks is already being done.
Yeah.
It's being done by your HR team. Sure. It's being done in the business, and just articulating that so that where you are in that responsive place, you can move a bit more confidently through that.
Yeah, that's well put. And from my perspective, I think the point you made right at the end is really germane, that most organisations are not burning down the forest and starting again when they think about the way in which they treat their workers, the way in which they allocate tasks, the way in which they set things like position descriptions or other expectations for the way work is done. All of those are psychosocial risk controls, and most organisations have most of it already in place. What I think is the opportunity here is to have a more sophisticated reflection on those issues, to look at the data that's available, the survey information that probably already exists in the organisation, the feedback you've received from workers, the insights that management teams have about issues like absenteeism and other things in the workforce, and kind of draw a more complete story. The bedrock will be there for many organisations. The ask, I think, is to do the next thing, which is to say, well, honestly, where do we think we can do some good?
Yeah.
And I've been telling clients, I don't think you can do it all this year. I do think you can have a lens of materiality. What are the things that you genuinely think are going to cause harm that are unaddressed? Get onto those, and then progressively work through the sort of better to have heading towards a higher order set of expectations regarding your own performance on this. But it's just impossible to achieve perfection in relation to all 27 or 30 psychosocial hazards in the guidance material. Look, thanks, Nerida. We could chat all day about this, and I'm very confident we could go for hours, but we won't. We really hope that's given you a kind of a snapshot of the sorts of issues we're facing, the way in which we're thinking about this with our clients, and giving you some insight and hopefully some opportunity for internal discussion. And of course, reach out to us if we can give you any further views. We're looking forward to bringing you more of these Inside Safety podcasts. We've got lots we can say on director obligations and executive obligations under due diligence. We want to have a chat about the role of lawyers in investigation processes for occupational health and safety matters, including in relation to the sorts of matters we've spoken about today. We'll have a discussion with you about what we think the trends are from the relevant regulators. We might even have some special guests over the course of the year. So thanks, Nerida.
Thanks,
and thank you all for listening. We look forward to seeing you next time.